live stream, and this is what is happening in that room. Are we on? Oh, okay, wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bruegel. Welcome to Brussels in a very eventful day where there is total strike in Belgium and there is a European summit. So you get to witness all the beauty of Belgium all in one day. It's well, yeah, just a very warm welcome before I pass on the baton to Stefan. I was just saying, it's quite unbelievable that we've come to an end of MICROPROD. It's been a tremendous project to work with, so I'm delighted that we participated as Bruegel, and I'm very looking forward to the two-day event on both the papers today and tomorrow the policy dialogues. And just a few administrative issues. Because we are live streaming, you need to turn your mic when you speak so that the people that are joining us from far away also be able to talk to you. If you're sitting up there, you also need to use the mic. Could you please sit at the edges of the table so we can see the slides? We have ordered a bigger screen to be there, but it's stuck in supply chains. So we've been waiting for about a year for this big screen. It's still not there, but it will come at some point. Now, with that, I will say no more and pass the baton to Stefan for a few introductory remarks. Stefan.
Thank you very much, Maria. Good morning from my side, and welcome to the final MICROPROD conference. Welcome also to those who follow the event remotely. So my name is Stefan Müller. I'm professor of economics working at the Halle Institute for Economic Research in Germany. And I'm here today because I'm also the coordinator of the MICROPROD project. So MICROPROD is a Horizon 2020 project. It's a consortium of researchers from Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany, Italy, Hungary, Netherlands. I hope I did not forget anyone. And we are cooperating closely. Belgium, I started with Belgium. And we are cooperating with national statistical institutes from various European countries. And the project started in 2019, so we are now coming to the end of our term. And yeah, the acronym MICROPROD stands for microdata and productivity research. And our starting point is understanding the productivity puzzle, so the long-run decline in productivity growth that we obviously as economists don't fully understand. So we had large growth rates in productivity back in the 60s and 70s, and very, well, minor growth rates in more recent years. And, well, our incomplete understanding of productivity growth is an issue. And our idea to tackle this problem is to go micro. So to really understand productivity growth and the lack of productivity growth, we think researchers should go micro. Micro means using microdata, microeconomic tools to tackle this issue. First of all, we think we need microdata to arrive at a modern measurement of productivity. So a lot of new potential drivers of productivity emerged over the last decades. Microdata is also important for spotting within firm drivers of productivity growth like innovation, changes in firm organization, and so forth. And last but not least, you also need microdata to understand a major driver of aggregate productivity growth, namely the famous Schumpeterian reallocation of resources from the least productive firms towards the most productive firms. So MICROPROD has essentially three goals. First of all, improving microdata for productivity measurement. Second, use microdata to understand drivers of productivity. And last but not least, we also broaden the scope towards, well, understanding distributional impacts and also understanding macro phenomenon. So you see, that's a fairly broad endeavor. So it's a huge topic. And we tackle this question from various economic sub-disciplines, including labor economics, industrial organization, trade, innovation, and also finance. So that's a very broad project that we are undertaking. And our output now, I think, includes mainly two things. First of all, establishing a platform to harmonize European microdata on productivity. So the aim is to make this accessible to external researchers one day so that you finally can just submit your program code, which will then be applied via a data interface to confidential microdata of several European countries, which is, of course, a very important thing because countries will react differently to the same shock. And think of the China shock working very differently for Germany than, for instance, for the US or other countries. The second output is we have been written about 35 scholarly papers. 35, I think, is a quite impressive number. And we also wrote several data and policy reports. I think this is enough for setting the scene about MICROPROD. Our final event is divided into two main parts. The first is today, is the scientific part. So we are going to present papers from all of our 6 academic work packages. And tomorrow, we will showcase the policy relevance of some of our projects and discuss this jointly with our Horizon 2020 sister projects, Global Into and Grow in Pro. Okay, so now let's get started with the first presentation. We have 45 minutes per work package, and we roughly divide this into 20 to 22 minutes for the presenter, another 10 to 15 minutes for the discussant, and then we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. The first presentation is from the Federal Statistical Office of Germany. Markus, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Steffen. So my name is Markus Zimmermann from the Statis, and I'm presenting a paper on offshoring. So this is together with my colleague Wolfhard Kaus, who's also in the audience, and this will be part of the MICROPROD deliverable 1.6. So in the recent decades, there has been a long discussion on the effects of offshoring and the consequences for domestic employment. Research has found somewhat ambiguous results. So theoretical models have emphasized, on the one hand, a downsizing effect, that firms are relocating part of their activities abroad that were previously performed domestically. And there's, on the other hand, a productivity effect that sourcing cheaper inputs may allow firms to become more productive and thus hire eventually maybe more workers. Also, the empirical literature has been a bit inconclusive. So the empirical estimates differ widely. Some find positive effects, some find negative effects. And one challenge in this literature is, among others, that offshoring is difficult to measure, that many data sets do not contain information about which firms have offshored and which not. So the literature has instead often used proxy measures based on international trade data. So the earliest ones are Feenstra and Hanson in the 1990s, which use industry-level data. And they define offshoring as the import of intermediate goods. So there's either a broad measure capturing all imports from all types of goods, and then a more narrow offshoring measure considering only imports from the same industry as the importing firm. So in our paper, we want to look at these issues a bit more deeply, and we use a data set from Germany called the International Sourcing Survey, ISS, from 2017. So in this data set, firms are asked directly whether they have relocated activities abroad that were previously performed domestically at the same firm. So we consider this a clean measure of offshoring at the extensive margin, because we can then separate true cases of offshoring from cases where, for example, the firm has expanded foreign activities, but the activity never occurred domestically in the first place. So, and then the ISS data are linked to other firm-level data, such as business register, Prodcom, or ITGS data. So we're actually studying 2 research questions. The first one is, what is the effect on domestic employment, production, and productivity? So we use, on the one hand, the direct survey evidence, where the firms are asked, how many jobs did you lose or create due to offshoring? For the other outcome measures, we also use a difference in difference propensity score matching. And the second question we look at is, how did the mix of import goods change for the offshoring firms? So we use different classifications that are used in the literature. So on the one hand, a classification based on broad economic categories, intermediate, capital goods, consumer goods. And then we also use a classification based on so-called produced goods imports. So that was a measure that was proposed by Bernard et al., which is a narrow measure of offshoring at the firm level. So a few words about the data. So we use the 2017 International Sourcing Survey. It's a sample of about 8,000 firms. So it includes firms with 50 or more persons employed. Of course, for many smaller firms, many of these trade concepts do not apply. The sectors include the whole non-financial business economy. The ISS surveys are carried out every 3 years by the NSIs of the EU member states. So the questionnaires are more or less harmonized across countries. And currently, they are done voluntary by the NSIs, but they will become mandatory from 2024 onwards. So in the survey, the firms are asked whether they have offshored at some time between 2014 and 16. So that's the reference period we consider. So this is offshoring is explicitly defined as a relocation of business functions abroad that were previously performed domestically. And besides the simple yes/no questions, there are other questions on destination region, which kind of business functions are affected, and how many jobs are lost and created. We should mention regarding the sample size, the sample is about 8,000 firms, but since offshoring is a relatively rare event, we only have 151 firms in the sample that actually are treated, that do offshoring. So this would put some limitations on what we can do regarding the analysis. We cannot do super detailed analysis in many aspects, but yeah, that's the way it is. So the ISS survey data are then matched to other firm-level data sources, and this will create a panel from 2011 to 2017. So the ISS itself is a cross-section, but then if we match to other firm-level data, we can create a panel. So we include the business register, which has a full coverage of employment and revenue and group membership. We have the ProdCom survey, which is a full census of manufacturing firms. And we have the international trade in goods statistics, ITGS, which has firm-level imports and exports of physical products. Also at a detailed product category. There are some methodological issues with the ITGS data. So there are rather high import-export thresholds in intra-EU trade. And also there's some care required in treatment of tax groups. We talk about that in more detail in the paper. So let's start with some descriptive statistics. So if we consider the reference period 2014 to 16, we see that about 3% of the manufacturing firms in the sample performed offshoring and about 1% of the service sector firms. So keep in mind that this refers only to firms with 50 or more persons employed. So this is already a selective sample of very large firms. We can also look at, for example, which business functions are affected. So here in panel A of the table, you see that production and service functions were more or less equally affected. In panel B, we see that the EU 13 countries, so Eastern European countries, are the most important destination region. And also in panel C, you see that most of the offshoring happens within the same enterprise group rather than outside the own group. Then one can look at different factors that determine selection. So here we look at different characteristics of the firms measured in 2013, so before the treatment, so to speak. And we see what I already found before in the literature, of course, is that offshoring firms are larger, more productive, and more likely in a foreign enterprise group. Then if you consider the pre-treatment employment growth in 2011 to 2013, we see rather similar employment trends before. Now we can look at the employment dynamics. So in the following, we will compare employment changes from 2013 to 2017. So like the before-after comparison, we see that the offshoring firms did decrease their employment only by little, by about 1.5%. But then if we compare that to the non-offshoring firms, we see that the non-offshoring firms in that time period had a relatively large employment growth of about 13.5%. So then if you take the double difference, so to speak, we have a negative employment effect of offshoring in the order of about 15 percentage points. But most of that negative effect is not because the offshoring firms shrink, but because they don't grow as fast as the non-offshoring firms. We then use also the fact that in the data, the firms are directly asked how many jobs did you lose and create, and we do a simple decomposition where we decompose the total net job change rate of the firm into the net job change rate due to offshoring and the job change rate due to non-offshoring reasons. So we see that the offshoring firms had a job loss rate in the order of about 15 percentage points, so they did destroy some jobs due to offshoring. They have also at the same time created some jobs due to offshoring in the order of about 4 percentage points. So for example, a job creation could be if the firm becomes more productive, it may hire new workers, or a worker may be shifted from one business function in the firm to another business function, and then that would be counted both as an employment decrease and an employment increase at the same firm. But then we also see, so the offshoring firms did destroy some jobs, but we also see that at the same time they had a relatively high growth rate due to non-offshoring reasons. And the total effect overall is the fact that the offshoring firms only changed their employment relatively little. We can also look more detailed at the skill groups, and we see that most of the job loss rate due to offshoring is for low-skilled workers. We also then consider other outcome variables like revenue and productivity. So here we do a difference matching estimation where we calculate the ATT, the average treatment effect on the treated, and we match on all the variables I've shown before, like size and group membership, and also the pre-treatment employment growth. So we see a negative effect on employment, which is what I showed before. We also see a negative effect on revenue, on domestic revenue, which is more or less of the same size, and then labor productivity as the ratio stays more or less constant. So it's a bit surprising we don't find an effect of offshoring on productivity. We should mention that here we are only considering labor productivity, so revenue per worker. We do not consider value added or TFP because that would require matching the data to the SBS surveys, which are also surveys, and the intersection between the ISS survey and the SBS survey would be relatively low. We would lose a relatively large number of observations. So we did not do that. Finally, we also looked at how did the import goods change. Which types of imports are increased for the offshoring firms. So we first have considered the so-called BEC categories, the broad economic categories. So this is a scheme that is developed by the United Nations Statistical Division, and they categorize goods regarding the end use into intermediates, capital and consumption goods, basically. And we see that the offshoring firms actually did decrease the share of intermediate inputs in total imports, while they have increased the share of capital goods in total imports. So this is a bit contrary to at least what the Feenstra-Hanson approach would say, that offshoring is associated with an increase in intermediate input. So here we find actually quite the contrary. We also consider the measure called produced goods imports. So that is asking the question whether the firms are importing the same goods they continue to produce domestically. So that measure was proposed by Bernard et al. For Denmark. We also replicate that here in the German data, and we actually find that we also find here in the German data an increase in the share of imports that are produced goods imports. So the firms import the same good they also produce domestically. So let me summarize the results. So we used the International Sourcing Survey data to look at employment dynamics of offshoring on the one hand. So we find offshoring firms overall do not shrink, but they grow slower than non-offshoring firms. which is generating the negative employment effect, we find that the offshoring firms do lose jobs due to offshoring, but they also gain jobs for other reasons. We should mention, to put these numbers a bit into perspective, that we are looking here at a time period where the German economy was very strong in the 2000s. So firms in general had very strong employment growth, at least the large firms we consider here. And also, we should keep in mind that we are considering a relatively late period of offshoring in the 2000s. So, of course, much of the offshoring has already happened 2 or 3 decades before. So this, what we consider here, might be a very specific type of offshoring, but it's the most recent, type. We don't find an effect on labor productivity. And regarding the effect on import goods, we find that the broad offshoring measure, where we just look at intermediate imports, does not seem to be a good proxy anymore. So that may have applied to offshoring that happened 2 or 3 decades ago, but at least for this time period, we cannot find that. And rather, we see that narrow measure of offshoring based on so-called produced goods imports seems to work quite well in the data. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Markus. The discussant is Peter Brun-Nielsen. Are you okay? So we are coming here. Okay, so I will leave my my chair for the discussant. And yeah, do you have slides?
Yes.
Okay, then I guess.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I don't know if someone could put on my presentation. It might be, it's okay.
The presentation on the laptop? No, it's there.
It's there. Okay.
Seems, but the format is a bit inconvenient.
Sorry. I'll see. Okay, thank you, and thank you for giving me this opportunity of discussing this very interesting paper, which, as also said, utilizing a source which is a direct measurement of offshoring. What I will do is that I will try to discuss based on some of the Danish experiences. This has this advantage of as Markus said, that the German sample is relatively small. In the case of Denmark, once we have carried out now 4 surveys on this topic. Secondly, it's carried out as a census, so all enterprises are actually asked. So we have a bit different material to analyze. Okay, the main takeaways, I will not go into the results because Markus has already in many details explained that. Just I would like to mention and underline that I think that the paper addresses this issue, this very, you could say, fundamental issue of offshoring or globalization is domestic and foreign employment. Are they actually substituting one another, or is it so that they are actually more complementary? This issue I would go into as well. And then I would like to mention the 4th point of your results, which you also mentioned. No single measure captures all forms of offshoring. I think that's a very important conclusion. This leads me then to the method you have been using. You have been using microdata linking at enterprise level. in that way, you obtain more granular data, which will reflect the heterogeneity of firms. So I think that's a very important method to use, and we see, not only in this case, but in general, more and more researchers are now actually using microdata. And then you have used a number of data sources. So what I will do now is that I will try to see, are there possibilities of supplementing the method and the model which you have used, and which kind of results would that then indicate? Okay, as you said, that the survey contains a huge number of variables. One of the variables is also related to domestic sourcing. Here you see figures from Denmark, so you can see domestic sourcing and international sourcing are about the same level over the years. And I would imagine that in the German economy, probably domestic sourcing would be more important than a small economy as the Danish one. So my question is, if you have used domestic sourcing, how would that actually have influenced the results of your data? Because that, of course, also can have an influence on the employment effects as well. The second one, also taking from the survey itself, that's the use of the business functions. For me, the concept of business functions is quite important. The idea was actually to be capable of distinguishing between a manufacturing enterprise sourcing their production jobs, or if they source, let's say, IT jobs or other administrative jobs. And as you can see, that is quite important. This is from the first survey, the Danish results, and you can see the difference between if you divide it by core function or by other types of support functions. So in the case of only other support functions, you can see manufacturing industry more or less seems to have the same result as the German case. An increase in employment even if they have sourced their jobs. But if you look at the manufacturing enterprises actually sourcing their core function, you can see that they go from around, in 2000, we measured it by using employment data, so administrative data for the whole period. So they went from 100, index 100 in 2000 to around 87 in 2007. That's a year after the first survey was carried out. So it's just to indicate that there is a difference if you use just if an enterprise has sourced yes or no, or if you go deeper down into the data using the type of business function sourced. So these are examples, I think, of variables interesting which are in the sourcing survey data themselves. If we then look a little bit further, and here there are differences between countries, so I cannot say what would be possible or not possible. This is another case from a Danish survey where we have matched the information with social statistics. So the idea we did here was to see that the issue of employment is not just an issue of the level of the employment, but it's also an issue of the composition of the employment. So what you can see here is a huge decrease in the number of unskilled persons employed for the enterprises which have been sourcing. And on the other hand, you see an increase, which I think you also have yourself in the ones with a longer education. I would say in our case, we have not used the survey data, but we have used social data. So we had the educational register linked with the data. So it's just to say this is a way you could actually further develop the model. I'm not sure if you are capable of doing that in Germany, but at least in some countries we can do that. Another issue I think is that's the global organization of enterprises. This shows the development in the employment in manufacturing industry. In the blue one is the enterprises located in Denmark, and the green one is the employment in the Danish affiliates abroad. So you can see what has happened since the crisis is a huge increase in employment abroad, and actually a stable employment after a dip in the domestic employment. So I think nowadays we have to, it's difficult just for us as statistical institutes just to focus on the domestic data. You have to put that into perspective of the development abroad as well. And then actually just the final slide, that is also something which we are trying to tackle. That's again the organization of enterprises globally. How should we interpret and capture international trade data? What we have seen so far is that if you look at the international trade in goods statistics, for instance, it's measuring goods crossing the domestic border. But what we see and have seen in recent years is that more and more goods produced by a domestic company, but not produced in the domestic country itself, but in a foreign affiliate abroad, that is increasing, and it's not coming back. So it is a difficult question, but I think it's something when we're utilizing the international trade data, we have to be aware of this issue. This is just to show the increase over the years. I've just looked also at the most recent data from this year, from last year, and it says that around 2/3 of all exports in Denmark are crossing the border from Denmark to abroad, but 1/3 is never crossing. It's never entering into Denmark. It's owned by Danish firms, but it's might be manufactured or it's sold abroad and never crossing the Danish border. So it puts into perspective how to use the international trade data as well. Thank you for giving me this opportunity of putting a perspective to this interesting paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So we are perfectly on time, it seems. So we have about 10 minutes for questions. And I see there are some questions. I propose that Markus is just taking the question himself. Yeah, you can also just start. That's a good point. Yeah, maybe start with that.
Okay, so thank you, Peter, for the discussion. I think you've raised a number of interesting points. So first of all, what you told about the Danish survey, that it's a census of all firms over the threshold. I think that approach makes some sense. It goes a bit into this large case unit idea that statistical agencies are now trying to better understand large companies, because large companies are very special regarding their international structures, regarding their trade schemes, and I think a full census goes some way to better get better data and to get a better coverage of the data. You have made a number of suggestions which we could implement with the data we have. So looking at domestic sourcing, whether that is complementing international sourcing. Domestic sourcing that could be used as an own treatment variable. That would probably be a different paper. but I think still interesting paper. It could also be used as a control variable, maybe in the analysis. Yeah, also regarding the business function, whether they have offshored the core business function or the support business function, we'll try to do that. I think there could be some limits, again, regarding the sample size. I mean, if you split it down to only firms that have only offshored their core function, or only offshored their support functions, probably you would have only a few number of observations left. But yeah, in general, I think it's a good idea. You also mentioned a number of interesting statistics. Matching the social statistics would be interesting to get better coverage of education. So unfortunately, that's not allowed in Germany at the moment by law. So the German statistics law only allows matching of enterprise level data, not social data. Also, yes, regarding the OFATs statistics, so the German affiliates in our case abroad, yeah, that's the statistics that is operated by the Bundesbank in Germany, not by the Status. Yeah, so at the moment it's also not possible to match those two. Regarding the interpretation of the ITGS data, whether the goods are crossing the domestic border, I agree that's an issue that I think has to be kept in mind. I could imagine that this is especially important for Germany, that German affiliates abroad are selling cars or machines or whatever goods without actually the imports coming back to Germany. Yeah, so I think that will be a challenge to really measure that correctly. Yeah, thanks.
Nice stuff. It was very interesting to see, and good that you're getting all these, seeing the benefits of the statistical agency of linking all these data together to make more useful reports. What struck me particularly was that your productivity, the diff and diff of the productivity growth was essentially flat. However, you showed that in the mix of high-skilled to low-skilled workers, it was mostly the low-skilled workers that left. So quality-adjusted productivity actually fell a lot. And then it makes you think, well, why did they go through this offshoring if they're going to lose? So I'd like to see you, maybe get gross operating surplus and see what happens with that. And then maybe try to find a way to say whether this offshoring was really a way to shift revenue abroad for lower tax reasons, whether it's really tax shifting going on here. And I think I bet if you go look carefully, you'll be able to make that case, which might have some political ramifications.
Directly to the question, or shall we collect? Okay, so yeah, thanks. I mean, that's interesting suggestion. So unfortunately, again, there are some data limitations. So the gross operating surplus, we don't have that in the register. We only have revenue, so the gross operating surplus to get that, or to get so we don't have balance sheet data. In Germany, we only have the SBS survey, the Structural Business Statistics Survey, and then again, we would have the problem with the low number of observations. And also regarding revenue, so what we have in the business register is domestic revenue of the domestic legal entities. So what we are not capturing is revenue by, for example, German affiliate abroad that is then selling the car. I think that's a similar comment as Peter made. So we don't capture that in the business register.
So I guess there's time for one more question. Maybe you can help me understanding. So you show that there's no increase in intermediate input imports, but firms are importing the same goods that they produce themselves. So what kind of business model is that? Do you have any interpretation of that?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is they are importing more capital goods instead of intermediate goods, and most of these produced goods imports are capital goods. We also did the crossing, if you cross the back categories and the produced imports category. So most of these are capital goods. So we are at the moment looking actually deeper which kind of products these actually are. So most of these are different forms of machineries and cars and stuff like that, motor vehicles.
So you can observe imports at the product level here, at the firm times product level.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, I don't see any further question. Thanks again to Peter and Markus. Very interesting topic, and we can move on to the second presentation. The presenter will be, so my computer turned off, Carlo. Very good. So Carlo, please come to us, and we are looking forward to your presentation. Maybe you take that mic.
I will just wait for the slide to be launched. In the meantime, let me greet all of you, and let me also say that it's a pleasure being back in person and meeting all of you after all these years of online meetings throughout the project, which in any case were, were instrumental and productive as we managed to conclude the project, as Stefan has said. So this is a joint work. Can you put it in presentation mode? Just click Ctrl L from, if you have a keyboard over there. I don't have any keyboard here, so I don't know. No. Thank you. So this is joint work with Gianmarco Ottaviano and Tommaso Sonno, and it's a paper on the general organization of business groups, and let's see if they manage somehow. Apparently not. I don't know why. Whatever. Let me be very quick, as we have very little time, and just to give you a sense of what we are doing. So I guess you all know business groups. This is a form of economic activity where there is one parent company which controls other independent companies through majority ownership. And as you know, business groups are very active subjects in our economies, and as a matter of fact, given the statistics, they are essentially key players in globalization. So what we are trying to see is how the organization of business group and the change in the organization of business group is going to affect globalization patterns. And in this sense, this presentation is also connected with the following one, which looks at the network of ownership and trade interlinkages. So we know from the statistics that most of multinational enterprises are business groups, and they are actually the Pareto distributed in the sense that large multinational companies might be relatively few, but they account for a disproportionate large amount of value added. And they are also very complex organization in the sense that most of those large companies are organized in different hierarchical levels of control, and they have under the same headquarter several hundreds companies, the 549 affiliates on average in the largest business groups. So what we want to know, as I said, is why business groups are organized in this way, what drives this type of organization, more or less vertically, hierarchically organized. And this is one paper which is a deliverable of MICROPROD. In this paper, which I'm presenting today, we look at how these organizational structures change over time. So we, just to fix ideas, you can think at the organizational structures of business group like 3 different type of shapes. Imagine always one headquarter on top, somewhere there, on top of these 3 blue pyramids. Then below the headquarter, you would have a group which can be organized as a pyramid on the left-hand side. So relatively few affiliates in the first layer of control, then control larger number of affiliates in the second layer, in the third, and in the fourth. This is the typical organization that you have, for example, at the European Commission, where you have one director general, a few directors, more heads of units, and then very many functionaries. However, we do have evidence that you can also have inverted pyramids for a number of reasons, mainly linked to the fact that headquarters want to retain control of core activities as close as possible to their own, let's say, direct control. So if you think especially at companies specializing in intangible goods, you typically would observe, or larger companies, or companies, as you will see, that are older. Typically those companies and business groups are born pyramidal and then evolve as an equilibrium, as an inverted pyramid, where they have very many affiliates in the first layer, typically doing relatively sophisticated stuff, and then as long as you move down the hierarchy, you have less affiliates which do simpler and simpler stuff. This is due to the fact that the ability to control decays through hierarchies, so you want to have a very simple task down the road and pretty more sophisticated tasks closer, and more core task closer to the headquarter. Of course, in transitioning from one shape to the other, you would have also this diamond shape transitional forms, which are not equilibrium strategies, and therefore you would observe them in the data. Now, what we try to gather is a sufficient statistics that would allow us to describe with one number these things, and typically what we use is a skewness measure. We just look at the skewness in the distributions of the affiliates across the different hierarchies, and typically you would have that left-hand pyramid would have a negative skewness versus inverted pyramid would have a positive skewness. And the average, the median distribution across our groups is around 0.1 or 0.2, so in terms of skewness. So you can imagine that around 0 you can split the distribution of groups into more pyramid-like, the more negative, the more pyramid they are, and more inverted pyramid, the more positive the skewness, the more inverted the pyramids they are. This is our sample, composed of 63,000 parent in 2008, then becoming 104, 10 years after, and 890,000 affiliates, then becoming 1.2 million affiliates over time. Of course, in this, we control for the attrition bias. We start with the sample in 2007, and we add affiliates and parents only when they appear not in the data, but economically, so through mergers and acquisition or through spin-offs, of course. Otherwise, you would have an horrible attrition bias, which we want to avoid. So this essentially is a core group of groups observed in 2007 that we see evolving over time. So this is the evolution in terms of number of affiliates by sides, and on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side you have the number of business groups also by size. As you see, all the purple lines are increasing in all the dimensions. Of course, you clearly see the Pareto distribution, very many relatively small groups and very few but relatively large groups. Here is just a snapshot of the fact that there is entry and exiting of affiliates, so there is a lot of churning in this data, around 15% of entry and exit. I'm sorry you cannot, because of value chains, you cannot really see these numbers because the screen is very small, but there is a lot of entry and exit. However, the main messages I wanted to convey, they will not be regression tables, they will be simple graphs, so don't worry, that will be easy to check. So there is a lot of churning. There is around 80% of incumbents, so affiliates that are with the group and always stay with the group, and between 15 to 20% of affiliates that entry or exit from the groups in our data. This is the overall variation of skewness over time. It is decreasing. Either you take the average or the median, but actually you can decompose the skewness in two terms. The skewness of groups that are always there and the skewness of groups that enter in the data. So the overall skewness is the result of this intensive margin and the extensive margin. The intensive margin is actually hump-shaped, meaning that right after the financial crisis, skewness has been increasing, meaning that once exposed to, let's say, relatively less constrained, incumbent business groups become more skewed, meaning more inverted pyramid. And this is a constant feature in the data that we can observe under very many circumstances. I'll try to tell you something also about some exogenous variation in this data. Of course, this is the overall distribution of incumbents. In terms of entrants and entry and exit, so the extensive margin contributes in net terms on the right-hand side negatively to skewness, which essentially means that typically small groups that enter in the data tend to be pyramids, and overall, since there are very relatively new groups, the overall skewness seems to decrease, but actually it is, as I said, the compositional effect of two things. Groups that become larger over time and older, they increase skewness, while new groups arrive as pyramid and then slowly become relatively less pyramidal. You can observe this in this graph, which shows the variation of skewness by 10-year age cohorts. So we divide the sample in firms between 0 and 10 years, 10, 20, 20, 30, and so on. And as you see, the older the firm, the more skewed the distribution, the more inverted pyramid it is. If you want to have another dynamic, interesting evolution, you could check for every cohort of firm how skewness varies 1 year after the other. And you can see those, so what you see in the first bar is relatively young firms, 0, 10 years, 10, 20, 20, 30, etc., etc. Essentially, you see two things here. You see that very many firms that are relatively young in the first column on the left-hand side tend to see an increase in skewness. So they, as long as they grow, they become inverted pyramid. The graph is split in two. On the left-hand side, you have groups that are always pyramid. On the right-hand side, you have groups that are always inverted pyramid. So those firms that are born pyramid increase in skewness and become inverted. Those firms that are born inverted remain inverted because the skewness, as you see, doesn't change much. And the fact that in the last column, very old firm, in the last column on the left-hand side, very old firm that remain pyramid, the standard errors are so large is because there are very few firms that are born pyramid and remain pyramid throughout of their life. So very few observations, okay? So essentially the tendency is, as I said, you're born a pyramid and then you become an inverted pyramid over time. Now, what we have done, we have checked whether these things are the result of some, let's say, shocks to the productivity, for example, of the group. So what we have done, we have checked whether some groups have a productivity shock throughout the lifespan of our data. And we do have, for very many thousands groups, groups that are subject to this productivity shock. On average, you can see at time 0 how big is the shock, and you can also see that when this shock happens, this shock tends to be persistent. Essentially, this is the result of volatility in business cycles. We relate this shock to volatility in business cycles across countries. We have the usual international trade story. When things get tough, the tougher become to play. So these groups experience through selection a positive shock. So essentially, we can relate exogenous shock to the business cycle to the productivity shock of business groups, and we are able to build an instrumental variable related to that. There is a literature on how exogenous business shocks, business cycle shocks, can be used as instruments to predict the behavior of business groups, and we are using essentially that story here. Now, the only thing I want you to show is that when there is a productivity shock, at time 0, skewness starts also to increase. So essentially, we do see a positive change in skewness as soon as we observe a positive productivity shock. The right-hand side, it is a change in skewness cleaned from group fixed effects, what I'm reporting there. Now, what we can show is that also statistically in our IV story that I have just explained, that a change in productivity maps into a change in skewness, and this is especially driven by positive productivity shocks affecting affecting groups that are especially strong for inverse pyramids. Although the results hold for all groups in general, as you can see here, but so this is any change in skewness on any change in productivity, but the result is driven by positive productivity shock that are, let's say, that lead to increasing skewness of groups. What we can summarize, we can do a number of robustness checks. This is controlling for GUO and country year fixed effect. So we take into account any demand shock or change in the tax environment or any other potential driver of this. And of course, we take into account fixed characteristic of the group that might affect. So this is entirely driven by the variation. And what we observe, I'm not going to comment these numbers, I'm just giving you the synthesis, that following a positive productivity shock, these findings hold. This is particularly strong for inverse pyramids, but in general, the findings that we find is in the IV strategy is that after a productivity shock, the number of closing subsidiaries gets smaller, so you tend to close less subsidiaries. You tend to open more subsidiaries, that makes sense. You tend to open more subsidiaries at lower levels of the hierarchy, but then you tend to move other subsidiaries up in the hierarchy. So you tend to reorganize the group structure by adding new subsidiaries at lower level and by moving existing subsidiaries upper in the level, so reorganizing the entire structure. And shift to upper layers are more frequent than to lower layers, which is consistent with the story that I've told you, that typically you tend to evolve from pyramids to inverse pyramids. In the companion paper that we have in MICROPROD, we do have, of course, a theoretical model where we can predict pyramids versus inverted pyramid structure, and we can do essentially compared, we can do exercises when we shock the productivity parameter. What happens to the structure of the group in equilibrium? Well, guess what? The groups tends to increase their skewness as following a significant productivity shock, ceteris paribus. Now, the last point that connects to the globalization story is that following a productivity shock, the reorganization also, a positive productivity shock, the reorganization also leads to the fact that the affiliates are placed farther away from the parent company. So essentially a positive productivity shock reorganizes the group in a more skewed way, more geographically spread. And this essentially takes place throughout the entire group, but especially for affiliates that are placed in the upper layers. So essentially the group is able to take core competitive advantages farther away from the parent company. That's essentially globalization, full stop, that we observe throughout. Now, the interesting thing is, and I'm concluding here, just showing you concluding remarks, that if you believe that the current set of events have led to negative productivity shock because costs of doing business internationally have increased through global value chains or simply through health restriction, and this translates into a negative productivity shock, then you would observe a deglobalization story driven by the reorganization of the group. So essentially groups would become less skewed and closer to home. Okay, and I conclude here.
Thank you very much, Carlo. We directly proceed with a presentation by Gianluca Santoni. Oh, Lionel jumps in.
I changed my passport.
Very good. So you're now Italian? No. Okay, please go ahead. You have 15 minutes.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. So Gianluca could not make it due to a stupid accident at home. And so he's also a victim of the value chains because he's waiting for, the device that would help him to walk. And so for the moment, he cannot. This is a joint paper with Gianluca about, as you can maybe read, the regional diffusion of foreign demand shocks through trade networks and through ownership networks. So basically what we have in mind is that individual firms have a certain productivity which is evolving over time. And these firms are located in certain districts, in certain countries. And these districts are trading with, the rest of the world. This is the direct impact of an external demand shock. And the districts within industries are also trading with other districts in the same country. And you have the same pattern for ownership, between districts within a country and for a given district with the rest of the world. So this is basically the idea of the paper, and this is what we try to capture in this exercise. So before going into the details, I would like to thank Giulio Vanelli, who is just over there, who has provided, wonderful research assistant in this project. And also Carlo, who has been very helpful with the Orbis data, because he is the master with Orbis data. So he did help a lot on that front. So this is it. And I understand that I have to click, otherwise in 1 hour we will still be on the first slide. Okay. So basically the motivating background is very simple. This is about this literature on business cycle correlation, the way shocks are transmitted through exports and through networks, as I said, and also this idea of co-movement between firms and all this literature on multinational firms and how their transactions contribute to transmitting shocks across borders. So this is the kind of literature we are considering. So what we do, to be very specific, is the following. So we have 2 parts in the paper. I'm going to present only the first part of it because this is too long. So in the interest of time, I will stick on firm productivity, but we replicate the exercise also for labor misallocation. So the question is how foreign demand shocks will impact productivity and how trade and ownership networks will transmit this shock. So we have 3 countries in the exercise, which are France, Italy, Spain. And for each country, we observe, I would say, the universe of manufacturing firms, the universe being firms that are present in Orbis. So this is not exactly the universe, but this is another discussion. So all manufacturing firms in France, Italy, and Spain. And these firms are located, as I said, in certain districts. And the districts are not 3 districts. And so we consider the demand shock that each district in each of the 3 countries is facing each year. Okay, so this is the idea. And you may say, well, the demand shock that you are facing is totally endogenous, etc. So we have to find a trick in order to circumvent this problem. And so what we are doing is that we are computing the variation in conditional import demand of foreign countries. And so this is done using a structural gravity framework. So we are trade guys. So this is the kind of things that we usually like to do. And then we have this foreign shock, which is independent from any productivity outcome of the firm. And this foreign shock is transmitted to all firms within the district through trade, through ownership, and between districts within a country through trade and ownership. So you may say you don't observe trade between districts within a country, but there is another trick I will tell you. So preview of the results. Most of the foreign demand impact is channeling through the combined network of trade and ownership. What is important is the combination of the trade and ownership network. So we compute the distance between the trade network and the ownership network. And when this distance is very small, then the impact of the shock is magnified. So this is the combination of the trade and ownership networks that matters. Now, if you consider firms that are connected with foreign markets through FDI, so if you look at the firm level, these firms have a much higher, response to the demand shock. So the response is 50% higher. So if you are connected as a firm through trade and ownership with a destination country where you have a demand shock, then this is a much higher transmission. And last but not least, within a country, let's say 60% of the total impact of an external demand shock will be channeling through the different districts in a given country via the ownership networks. So this is the idea. So this is about, let's say, this is not foreign direct investment, this is domestic direct investment, if I may say so. So the data, as I already said, is Orbis. Then for each firm, you know what is in the balance sheet because this is what you need to compute the TFP. So you know also what the location of the headquarter is. And you also know the sector of activity of this firm, which is NACHE revision number 2, so the 2-digit one. And you have the ownership network. And we observe the ownership network before the shock. So this is the big difference with the previous paper. We don't look at the transformation of the ownership network, the transformation of the structure of the firm in response, etc. No, we say, okay, we just want to take something which is totally exogenous. So we observe the structure of the firm before the shock, then we shock, and then we see what the response in terms of productivity is. So this is kind of different exercise. Okay, and so as for the conditional import demand, we use kind of a shift share. I will show you how it works in a second. And last but not least, since it's always good to have nice graphs, I won't have graphs, but I will show you two maps that correspond to a certain quantification of the pandemic shock replicated with this data in order to visualize somehow how the districts and the sectors, contribute to the transmission of the shock. Okay, so the firm level outcome variables, we have a series of measures of productivity. I do not enter into the details because you all know this better than me, but what we prefer is the TFP computed with the translog, so the usual thing which is done. Okay. So now, more interesting, the conditional import demand. So you all have in mind the structural gravity framework. So just to say, maybe you don't see, or probably you don't see, but my subscripts are the following. O is the origin, D is the destination, K is the sector, T for year. And so we just regress at this level exports within a sector from one origin to a certain destination. And we recover here the inward multilateral resistance term, which is the fixed effect with the dimension destination, sector, and year. So this is the inward multilateral resistance term. And we know, since Anderson and Van Wynkoop, that this is capturing the theory consistent determinant of demand. And so this is what I call conditional import demand. So now what I need is to weight these terms that are estimated in order to recover the shock. And this is what I do in the next slide. Here we go. So in order to weight this shock, I will compute what is the share of a certain destination in the exports of a certain district in a certain industry in 2009, so before the shock, okay? And then I take these weights and I use simply the terms that I have been estimating before. So this is the weight, times the exponential of the term that I have been estimating before. And I sum this over all destinations, okay? And so this gives me, for a certain destination, for a certain district J, exporting in sector K, in year T, the shock which is corresponding to this year. Okay, now the trick that was announced before, we don't have domestic trade. So what to do? We will reconstruct domestic trade, again with kind of gravity equation. So what we do is that we take internal trade in Europe, between European countries, because this is, plausibly the situation where you have less non-tariff barriers, etc., because in principle we shouldn't have any, but we know that it is not so simple. We still have some border effects, but still. So we just compute the elasticity of trade flows to distance between countries in Europe. And we use this to recover what should be trade within countries in Europe, okay, between districts. This is what is done here. And so this is kind of virtual trade in a given year between two districts within a country. Now, what I do is that I use this virtual trade and I will weight the shocks that I've been estimating before of the other districts in the same country in order to recover the spillover from the demand shock which is received by other districts, the spillover on my own district. This is how it goes. And remember that firms are located in a certain district, in a certain country, in a certain industry. So this is how it goes. Now we have all elements, and we have simply two equations that are estimated. One, which is regressing the outcome here, can be, for instance, productivity, on the demand shock. And so the demand shock is estimated how? This is the 5-year difference. This is a rolling window, moving average. Over 5 years, over the last 5 years. So this is the demand shock, which is faced by a given district J in a certain sector K, in a certain year T. And we have fixed effect corresponding to district time, industry time. So this is clean from all this. And since we are working with differences, we can get rid of the firm fixed effects. Okay? This is what we do. And then we will estimate the same sort of equation with another term that will be the spillover. But this will be exactly the same specification with the spillover on the top of it. Okay, so this is where we are. So the blue parameter that you see here is what we are interested in. So this is positive, as you would have expected, meaning that when you are facing a demand shock, a positive demand shock abroad, as a district, as an industry, then all firms, on average, located in this district and in this industry, will enjoy a positive productivity shock. So the magnitude is as follows. If you have a 10% demand shock, it will increase productivity by 0.4%. You may say, oh, that's not big. So we looked at a paper which is doing something quite similar, but they are using demand shocks at the firm level, not at the district level. So to us, this is more endogenous, but still, this is a paper by Gianmarco Thierry Mayer and Mark Melis, if I recall correctly. And so they obtain magnitude which is twice as large, but this is because they are observing the shock at the firm level while we are observing the shock at the district level. I will be on time. So this is the baseline result. And then we have a series of dummies that we add for FDI linkages, whether there is a FDI linkage in this industry, in this district, whether there is a huge synchronization between trade and ownership networks, as I said before. So we take above the median, so this is the dummy 1, and below the median, this is 0. Whether a firm in particular is directly connected through international ownership networks. And so what we show, as I said in the preview of results, is that this is the combination of the two networks, the trade network and the ownership networks, that makes really the big difference. Now, let's directly go to the pandemic. So what we do is that we just want to give a kind of visual, evidence of what all this machinery is telling us. And so we are computing a COVID demand shock using monthly data of exports for the 3 countries. And we look at the period in 2020, so the first 3 quarters of 2020 compared to the first 3 quarters of the previous year. And we use the same weights as before, and we run the machinery in order to see what it gives. And I will show you these maps. They are very nice. Thank you for noticing it. So this is the situation where we compute the impact of the shock without FDI on board. So there is no FDI here. And here we compute it when we combine trade and FDI. So this is the combination of the trade and ownership networks, while here you have only the trade network. And so the darker districts are the districts that are hit more seriously. So this is a decrease in productivity in that case, indeed. So if you are darker, this is worse for you. And so what we see is that most of the story is about the interplay of the trade network and the ownership network. And now, more than this, we can drill a bit into the districts and look at the industries that are affected in the districts, because this is a weighted average of the shocks that hit the different industries in each of the districts. And so we can drill into it and we can put names on it. So I won't, because this is firm level data. I am not authorized to give names. But imagine that in Toulouse, aircraft is very much affected. We don't know which firm is it. It is, indeed. But this is a manufacturer of aircraft in Toulouse. In the east part of France, we have a French manufacturer of cars. We also have a manufacturer of luxury bags for ladies, etc., etc. And we also have staff in Italy with, fancy apparel in Milano. So this sort of thing. So we can put names on these things. And so what is really important is to see, and this is the conclusion at the end of the day, that this is the combination of the two. So to wrap up, we quantify foreign demand shocks and how they affect directly and indirectly the productivity of the firms. We do that also for labor misallocation, but I didn't have time to present it. And so the global shocks that we all have in mind, and so the pandemic is one, but there are many more, are transmitted at the district and the industry level through the trade network combined with the ownership networks. And so this is really the overlap of the two which matters. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Lionel and Carlo. So we have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. I would have one or two, because I don't. Oh, I see. Eric has a question. Please go ahead.
thanks very much to both speakers. Quite interesting stuff. Kind of two comments, and mostly it's just to trigger some out-of-the-box thinking about the results we have. One is for Carlo. The age profile of the anti-pyramid movement. Could there be something internal to kind of, theory of managerial behavior in firms, that as the firm ages, the manager just wants to increase their span of control by having things tightly linked to them rather than it going through various levels of a supply chain where you don't have much control. You're just kind of reliant on what comes up the pipeline. And instead, they're really trying to create little fiefdoms. And so the managers who are close to the headquarters are all just building empires. So that's counter, and how do you make sure that that's not what's happening? On this last one, the interpretation of the shock going to TFP, one thing worries me is that it's, as far as I can see, it was kind of contemporaneous, the shock. And I'm not sure that a trade shock leads to an immediate change in actual productivity. But what may be going on is, especially these FBI firms are heavily in intangibles, even if it's just the intangible of a network structure. And so as trade goes, they're able to shift variable inputs, but their fixed inputs are fixed. And so it looks like productivity is declining because you've misspecified your production function. And one way to test this maybe is to see if this negative shock coefficient is much larger for intangible heavy firms than more like constant returns to scale firms.
As I have a similar question, I just follow up on Eric's question to Lionel, also about the nature of the TFP shock here. So that immediately two kind of things that pop up in my mind. The first one is whether this could be just, this TFPR, it's a price thing. So is it about prices? Is the demand shock transmitting via prices? Can you test for that? That's the first question. And the second is also related to what Eric said about the short-term nature of the shock. So is it about labor hoarding, for instance? So are firms just not kicking out their workers because they know it's a temporary shock? Can you somehow look at this and test for this? This would be kind of interesting. And for Carlo, you said that a positive shock leads to more subsidiaries, if I remember correctly, and that there's a promotion of subsidiaries up the hierarchy level, or is it more layers? So what is happening there? Thanks.
Okay, and then if I am allowed, I also have a comment for you now later. Okay. So there is a literature, as you know, on managers within organization building empires and so on. I think Dalia Marin has a paper on that, if I'm not wrong. So that clearly could be the case. However, I didn't have time nor the willingness to go through the model, which is in the other MICROPROD paper here. And if you go through the model, what you find is that when you calibrate the model for a plausible set of parameters based from the data, is that the inverted pyramid seems to be the outcome equilibrium. You have to have a very special configuration of parameter for having a pyramid as an equilibrium mode. And in the data, most of the organizational forms of larger companies tends to be inverted pyramid. And when you shock the model with a productivity shock, you would tend to see the skewness increasing. So it seems that there is a configuration of parameters, ceteris paribus, that leads to higher pyramid in a profit maximizing setting rather than, let's say, an empire building setting. Or if anything, the two tends to coincide. Of course, we have a dynamic setting, while the model is a static setting, so we are just comparing different steady states. However, since the the productivity shock is persistent, you could imagine that you're moving from one type of configuration of parameters to another one, so you are basically comparing two sort of two equilibria. Okay, so that's the first question. Second, what we do find, yes, is that there is a tendency, we didn't check directly the number of layers added, which is a good suggestion, Stefan. We did check that there is a tendency to increase, to open new affiliates, and the new affiliates tends to be opened at below median layers compared to upper median layers in terms of the extensive margin. But then there is also a higher probability of having, of seeing affiliates with existing affiliates moved upward in the hierarchy. So the overall result of the productivity shock is that groups become larger and relatively thicker at the upper part of the distribution as a net result. There is a churning, but that's the net result, which again is consistent with the priors of the theoretical model calibrating the two steady states. Now, the question for Lionel, if I can, since, thank you, relates to the, it's very interesting, your results, and I could see immediately, I spotted there, no, sorry, the French air producer. I also saw an Italian car producer in the north. Yes, in Turin, I guess. It looked like Turin, at least the dark spot that you had there. So in those cases, however, you wonder to what extent your identification of demand shock is exogenous, because clearly here these are very large companies that would be able to significantly affect the elasticities that you are measuring. And it's, so I assume that if you can maybe control for that, probably your 8 times higher effect of FDI might be slightly lowered by this. But it's just, I didn't have time to speculate on the exact identification issues, but the sense is that something of the idiosyncratic presence of large companies in certain districts at that level of disaggregation might affect some of your elasticities.
Okay, thank you for these comments. And so on Eric's comments, so the contemporaneous shocks. So I take the point that looking at firms having a lot of intangibles is a good idea. So this is something we can examine. Now we have been doing, as you can imagine, a ton of different specifications with lags, etc. And so it's quite robust. And so I think that the comment is absolutely right when it comes to the final exercise of quantification for the pandemic. So this is just illustrative. But for the rest of the paper, when we take this 5-year increase or decrease in the productivity, etc. So I think that we are safe on that side. But clearly, when we present this quantification, just to visualize how trade and ownership networks interplay within sectors. So this is more an illustration than something which is really correctly estimated, because this is not the point. On Stefan, unfortunately not. We cannot observe prices. So the reason is that we are looking at trade at the district level, so for all firms, etc. So we would be obliged to construct complex and possibly odd price indices across firms, products, etc. So this is not something that we could do. So this is typically something that you would like to do, working with one country, firm level data only, etc. But here we adopt this approach, which is very much in line with the idea of MICROPROD that you rightly pointed out when you introduced the workshop, which is somehow to bridge the micro and the macro. So we are just here, the micro, the macro, and the regional somehow, and this is what we try to do. On Carlos' point, so this is also something that we have been, thinking of. And so I think that you are somehow right, because what we show is that this is precisely the spots where you have these big firms having, affiliates everywhere in the world, etc., that the shocks are transmitted the most. So you are perfectly right. But there is no way we could get rid of this, and this is why we decided to start with the trade and ownership network before any shock, in order to limit this endogenous bias. So this is not 100 perfect, so maybe I oversold a bit the exogeneity of the demand shock. But this is the best that we can do with the data that we have, for sure. And there is no way to instrument this.
Okay, thank you very much. So due to all speakers having very concise and on time, we are on time for the lunch break. Almost at least. So there will be 1 hour lunch break, and well, assuming that the lunch break is not live streamed, I'm saying goodbye to all our remote speakers and hope to see you again at 1:30.